Sudhir, and I'm going to be talking about a couple of things that I've learned recently in Go, which we use quite a lot at our company. How many of you here already use Go in some capacity, either in personal projects or at work? Oh, you got. That's actually very few people for a Google Devfest. It's like everyone's on to Flutter now instead. Okay, so why we use Go at Cube Cinema is actually an interesting question because it's something that's fairly new for us and it's something that we're betting on quite heavily. And our reason for using it is because we deal with the kind of problems where it works really well, where, for an example, we do movie releases. So if you make a movie and you come to us and you say, I want this to go to 15,000 theaters all over the world, then we'll handle that for you. Now, in order for a movie to go to that many theaters all over the world, we need to have that many theaters in our databases. We need to make sure we pull up information about those theaters. We need to make sure we know what the serial numbers of all the servers in those theaters are. We need to make sure that we encode and decode movies for those theaters. We need to provide licenses out. So in cases like this, where we have a lot of points of work to do, and we want to do it really fast, Go is an excellent choice. So I'll walk through one portion of our system that uses it. What I'm talking about right now is a place where we store the licenses for every single movie show at every theater. And if you want to download all these licenses, you can go ahead and do so. But the problem is that we don't really know what you're going to download for. So if you come in and you say you want everything in the world, then that's a huge number of licenses. If you want only North India, then that's a different number. South India, that's a different number. So the point of this library is to allow you to create a zip file as easily as possible out of a large number of small files. Right? So the API for this looks a bit like this. You do a very simple HTTP post into any endpoint. And you mention what kind of file name you want, and you say, I want all these files to come in that zip file. So this can be anything, really. Even if you want to use it to create a zip file of all the photos in your photo library, you can do that. Or all the receipts in your account systems, you can do that. It doesn't really matter what kind of files you put into it, right? So if you have a large number of files over here, how would you then pull them out into a program in parallel? This can be, let's say, 1,000 or 10,000 or even a lakh. How do you pull them all into a program in parallel, write them out as a zip file, without actually consuming too much RAM also? Because these files can be kilobytes in size or megabytes or even gigabytes in size. How do you actually make sure that you don't need as much RAM as you have files in order to send a zip file out? So Go is actually excellent at these things. And let's talk about why and how you could do something like that. So the first thing we look at when we look at the Go program is, actually wait, let's go through the structure itself. So Go, we'll start off with the main function, which is what executes whenever you start up the system. And we'll say, just start the server. That's pretty much all we're going to do here. Our server is quite simple. We set up a library that does a few things for us, like logging and error handling. And we say, handle the zip. Call this function here. So the first thing that you'd want to think about in Go is that everything is an interface. It's not an object-oriented language in the sense that you don't have your regular objects and you define methods on them. There's no classes, I think, of that sort. But we'll come to how you can do object-like work in it. But the first thing that you can look at is that anytime you write something in HTTP, all you're doing is getting a response writer and a request. Right? So these two are either interfaces or structures. Now, what we're trying to do over here is, say, add a couple of headers over here to say this is a zip file. Then we're going to make a queue of all the files that we can get in. and we're going to send those files into that queue. And we're going to start a couple of workers. And in those workers over there, we're going to start a bunch of Go routines. We'll come to what those are to download all these files, and another Go routine to zip them in and put them out. Right? So this is actually pretty much the entire structure of the program. So what you're doing over here is you're fetching everything off the request, and you're creating what's called a channel. Has anybody worked with streams before? Yeah, so channels are a lot like streams in that if you have two parts of your application and you want to put something into the channel and take it out somewhere else, that's what you would do with a Go channel. What we're doing over here is trying to use the channel as a queue. Right? So we come in over here and we say, let's take a file and let's download that file. Now the way that we would perform our downloads over here is to use a number of workers to take things off the channel and start the download. Right? So that's one thing you can do extremely easily over here. What we're doing over here is to go ahead and just take things off that channel, download them, and then put them out into another channel. What we do here is we take things off the output again and we put them into a zip file. And now, essentially what this does for you is even if you have 1,000 files, each of them will download 5 by 5 or 10 by 10 or whatever you specify here. And when you get each of those files into your system, you're not going to get the entire file. You're only going to get a few kilobytes of it at a time, zip it up and send it out again immediately. Right? So that's basically the advantage that Go offers you. So I'd like a couple of questions now on how we would do this in any other programming language, and how would you approach a problem like this in either JavaScript or Python or Ruby? Anybody who's worked in JavaScript? How would you approach something like this in JavaScript? Or Ruby or Python? So the usual way is to download the entire file onto memory and store it on a hard disk, and then attempt to zip it. Right? Now, the problem with that is you're essentially downloading way too much data into your application itself. So what we're going to try and do here is to make sure we don't have to do that. So if you look at what we do with Go, is we say, fetch my downloads. But the good thing about Go is that whenever you start to download something, you don't get the entire file itself. What you get is only an object and a reader, of which you can pick out as much information as you want, and put that information into a zip file again. So this is an example of how that would work over here. So you have a writer that you want to send the response out as, and you open that up inside an archive, and you just say, whatever comes out of this writer, I want it to come out as a zip file itself. And then into that you would create each of your files and copy over the response body. So this is a really important line that basically says, instead of trying to load up my source file into memory, just copy it over into the writer bit by bit. So what this allows you to do is never have to load up your entire file into the application's memory. You can just send it out into your writer piece by piece. And that's actually pretty much the entire application itself. So what we're trying to do over here is basically say that if you want to learn Go, that's a really interesting place to start. Find applications that require you to do a lot of work, preferably many small pieces of work, and start learning how to use channels and synchronization to go ahead and do that. I'm actually okay with closing with this unless there are some more questions. No? So the most alternatives that you will see in programming languages is that you will have to copy it into a local file, or you'll have to copy the whole thing into memory. What some programming languages will do is let you stream data from one place into another place, right? And that kind of operation is what Go excels at. So the alternatives in another language would be to create basically streams, any kind of streaming library, and take out information piece by piece and then put it somewhere else. And so the question was, how would something like this be different from a peer-to-peer network where you have seed files and then only them onto computers? So the point over here is more to centralized distribution where you come in and you don't know the list of files that you want to zip up yet. So instead of saying, here's a very large number of files out, or normally what you would do is have these on S3 or Google Cloud or somewhere else, and then give those out in a controlled fashion. So that's more what it's for. But if you had the list of all the files, you could actually distribute it in a seed way as well. Yes. So what actually happens over here is that we don't actually download and zip it up. So that's the interesting thing about Go, is that if you take a look over here, we take a response writer, and we pass this response writer in here, right? So, and then you wrap that in the archiver. So the moment you do this, what actually happens is that the data that comes in over here does not reside in your application at all. As it comes in, it goes into the response writer and it goes out immediately. So even if you're trying to zip a file that's many gigabytes large, it'll only occupy as much memory as the buffer itself which you're operating on, which is a few kilobytes. Any other questions? Thank you.